You're listening to episode 136 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Lama Tsomo joins us to speak about the value of sitting with others. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made possible from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going. And if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. Meditation practice can be easy and it can be difficult. Sometimes just getting to the cushion or chair is hard enough in the busyness of the day. But even for those of us who might prefer solitude, there are benefits above and beyond social connection when we sit in the company of others. Lama Tsomo teaches Tibetan Buddhist practices in the United States and abroad. Born in a Midwestern Jewish household, she followed a path of spiritual inquiry that ultimately led her to ordination as one of the few American female lamas. Working closely with her teacher, Tulku Sangak Rinpoche, she is currently overseeing the creation of the Namchak Retreat Ranch in Montana, in addition to teaching workshops and retreats. She's the author of the award-winning Why is the Dalai Lama Always Smiling?, which introduces modern students to the principles and practices of Tibetan Buddhism. Our guest today is Lama Tsomo. Welcome to the podcast. Glad to see you. Glad you're here with us.
Ted, glad to be back.
Now, this is so interesting for those who are listening to this particular podcast. Lama Tsomo has been a guest on another podcast that I do, so I'm just so delighted to be able to bring her to this audience and this venue as well, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. But let's start with this new group, some of whom might not be familiar with you and your work. Maybe you can say a bit about your background.
Well, I didn't set out to be a Lama. I'll start with that. I was a psychotherapist, mainly because I was fascinated by the human mind and how it works, and noticing that we all want to be happy and nobody wants to suffer, and we are spending all day, every day trying to be happy and push away suffering, and somehow we don't succeed very well. And so I thought, well, there must be methods by which we can do this. And so I studied the best of the West and became a therapist and had a practice and so on, and even wrote a book from that point of view. And then I stumbled upon a Tibetan Lama who was just starting to come to this country, didn't know English, still doesn't know English. And I got to be like his first American guinea pig to try these Tibetan practices on. I found them so highly developed and useful for myself. And it just became more and more impressed with how well they were working for me, that I wanted to share them with others. So I did the whole course of study that he laid out for me, which happened to be the Lama training. And he insisted on giving me the Lama title and doing an ordination and so on. and then giving me the responsibility of teaching. But actually, I was fine with that because I did want to share these methods with fellow Westerners in English in a more American style.
Thank you for that background. And one of the things I'm curious about as you spoke is you had this full, and still have, of course, this full training in Western ways of doing therapy, and also from traditional Buddhist practice. And I'm curious, as you started really delving into your training with your teacher, what were some of the things that stood out that were some of the strong similarities and maybe some of the differences that you found to be really interesting for you?
Yeah, that's a huge question and fascinating to go into. It helped that part of my background was Jungian psychology because Jung went deeply into archetypes and popularized that word. In fact, the Tibetans are masters at working with archetype to affect deep and lasting change on the level really of transformation. And archetype, I found, reaches much further back into the brain and across the brain than talk therapy, which only works with like the left frontal lobe and a few other, little bits here and there. But we've discovered that, both hemispheres are important, and there are many more pieces and parts of the brain that need to be engaged and in concert with each other to affect these deep changes and affect your whole view of yourself and of life. And so that, again, the Tibetans are masters at using archetype for that, and also to coordinate a group of people to do group practice together. Because if you're all focusing on an image, which is worth 1,000 words, then it's very powerful. Like the difference between ambient light with the waves going up and down haphazardly and laser light, where they go up and down in concert with each other. So group practice can be quite powerful when you take advantage of something like archetype.
Yeah, so let's segue into that. I know that's one of the two main topics that we want to get into in our conversation today is talking about meditating with others. And I'm curious what really interests you about this particular way of engaging with contemplative practice.
Well, I'm going to start with a confession. I'm an introvert, which doesn't mean that I'm shy or afraid of people. Actually, the way Jung meant it is that my life happens more on the inside and not so much on the outside. And so the idea of, let's say, on Friday evening after a busy work week, the way I relax is just being quiet by myself, maybe reading, going for a walk, something like that I've sort of slowly come to the realization that group practice has some really important things to offer for us, any of us, even introverts like myself.
And you're not alone in that. But just for folks listening, I know there are a number of people who listen to this podcast who would also consider themselves introverts. And group practice can be challenging, and we'll go into that in a little bit. But just to let folks know, and Lama, you as well, you're not alone. I am also an introvert. I get re-energized by solitude, not by being with others. That can be really quite exhausting, and that presents an interesting spin on how to practice with others.
Yeah. So, someday maybe I should write a blog on, group practice for introverts, the case for group practice for introverts. So, and it's interesting for me to talk about group practice as an introvert approaching it, because I was not going to be an easy sell. What I found was that there are wonderful aspects to being able to be on the cushion just with myself and doing exactly the practice I want for how long or short I want and with the theme I want and so on. Also, there's something to be said for, this solitude sort of meditation that is important. But there's also a benefit to the tide that a group of people creates to carry everyone further than any one of us would go alone. And just to give you kind of a little hint about the power of group when it comes to mindset and so on, if you've ever been to, I don't know, a rock concert, let's say, or a political rally, I mean, everyone gets swept up and goes much further in that direction than they would on their own. It can also be, as with anything, a double-edged sword, because lynchings happen with mobs, right? And they tend not to happen without groupthink. But we are herd animals. So the power of group can carry your meditation in a way that otherwise you can't really do alone. So why not both and? So let's say you could go to a group meditation once a week, or even with one other person, it makes a difference. I think it's in the New Testament where two or more are gathered, there I am. Because, Buddha mind, if you will, or enlightened mind, is always everywhere, actually. And we can each access it any time, because what are we made of? There's this, one great ocean of awareness that's the source of everything. And that would include us. So I like to access that sometimes independently in solitude, and then other times in group. And it's just a different experience. And why not have both and? But there's another reason for group meditation. If this audience is anything like everybody else in America, in modern life is going in the opposite direction. It's like we're going against the tide to do inner work at all. And we're constantly being almost really pressured to react and respond to things on the outside all the time. And we have too many things to do in too many directions. And how many minutes do we have to meditate? This kind of thing. And we're counting our internet life by nanoseconds, right? And we drive in cars faster than we could walk. And that's causing life to go by so fast. So it helps us when we're trying to establish and nurture the practice of doing daily practice, which, by the way, if you don't have that one, you won't have any other ones, right? So in cultivating and nurturing that, it makes a huge difference to have other people who are trying to do the same things. And if you look at Soul Cycle or diet groups or, many other groups, they succeed because where people individually fail, whether it's exercise or diet or any other habits we're trying to establish and keep going, it's just so much easier if you have a group to come back to again and again.
Yeah, even the positive influence of peer pressure, which can be a positive influence. I think about training for a marathon. I would not have been able to do that on my own, but knowing that there was a group of people that were really friendly and encouraging and supportive was inviting and welcoming. And that support, whether or not one is, prefers solitude, we're still social creatures, biologically, neurologically, we're still wired for that. So to have that support can really help energize us to areas we might not otherwise be able to get to on our own.
As a matter of fact, I was talking to an ultramarathoner who, has a huge amount of discipline, and everybody in ultramarathon races has pacers, right? People who run like just ahead of them,
and for only a few miles.
That's right. But, it makes all the difference that you have that companion to go those steps with you. So, those are all kinds of reasons why this introvert actually does believe in group meditation. Then it gets really interesting with Tibetan style group meditation, because they do use archetype in all sorts of ceremonial ways. And again, I was a hard sell with ceremony, I have to tell you. But because of my background in Jungian work and understanding archetypes, I could kind of get it. Oh, they are coordinating everybody's minds to be focused on this archetype and this process with the archetype at this moment. And moment by moment, we are all really in sync. It can be quite powerful and just a profound experience.
So let's talk a little bit about some ways that we might find support for group practice in face of maybe some challenges around just getting to it, or really opening that up to help us with our practice. What are some things that you've found to be helpful for that?
Well, one easy entry point, if you can't find a group to meditate with, is to start with just one, what I call meditation buddy. And so we at Nanchak have a toolkit to help people get started, whether it's with what we call a learning circle, which is just like a handful of people in somebody's living room, like just easy and, really simple evening agenda, and people can trade off taking the group through the agenda. And there are some suggested reading materials, that kind of thing. We have an online course, for example, and a book and, various books we recommend. But then if somebody could do it with just one other person and the toolkit would still work for them.
Mm-hmm.
We're working on a workbook and a journal and things like that. So those are possible entry points. I also want to mention another reason for group meditation. We're talking really about developing beloved community. That's the little secret that happens over time. When people share what's going on and off the cushion for them and about things they really care about, they develop what Martin Luther King referred to as beloved community. And we all kind of want that. So we might start by, going there for establishing this habit, but we'll keep coming because of that. There's another thing that happens, though. The Buddha had 3 jewels he had in mind, and I think he had good reasons for all 3. There's Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So we're talking about Sangha, right? And we are herd animals, and I think the Buddha understood that. And it's also a way for us to check ourselves to see when we're alone on the cushion, we may feel very saintly. And then in the face of somebody who's annoying us in the learning circle or even the meditation buddy, do we say something? Do we not? How do we say it skillfully? How do we be? How do we bring awareness, compassion, and loving kindness and that point of view of being fellow waves on one ocean in the midst of this difficult interaction? That's where the rubber can hit the road. So I feel it's important that we learn from each other, and we do use each other as mirrors. Sometimes it's horrible. If people are bullying somebody, then they're functioning as terrible mirrors for that person, that the person can't help but take it in. And that's what's so devastating about it. But on the plus side, if people see the essential good in each other and keep looking at that, that was my secret sauce as a therapist. I had the bag of tricks that I learned, in my training, but really the secret sauce was I had been meditating. I had once again and again, come in contact with and become familiar with my own Buddha nature, my own true nature, which is pure, because that's really what we're all made of. We just got mixed up and, distracted. And then that allowed me to see it in the other person. And I got to keep practicing and practicing that. But when I could see it in the other person and I was functioning as a fellow mirror in that way, I think that was more therapeutic than anything else I did. I think that was 80% of the therapy.
And it's interesting in community, one also has the perspective of, particularly when they're sharing, when individuals are able to talk about what's happening in their practice and in their lives, whether it's the walk from the car to the place where you're sitting, or if there's some social time, or during sharing an inquiry, if that's part of what it is you're doing in the group, is learning from others, as if this is, I never thought about this way, because there's an entire room full of minds and hearts and experiences that are not mine. And so that place, in Zen we call it the mountain seat, where you're in that teacher spot, that's really being able to see that as a learner place, because you are also there learning from others with everything they might have to share.
Yeah, well, and we'll go into a very timely topic, which is the benefit of diverse points of view. We get very one-dimensional just sitting on the cushion by ourselves. And frankly, our practice gets kind of dry, but it's much more 3D when we're sitting with a bunch of other people, hopefully who are, many of them, quite different from ourselves. Yeah, because that does enrich it. But I also want to mention that just doing shamatha and vipassana, or Zen, the typical Zen practice of counting 10 to 10 and starting over again and that sort of thing. That creates the ability to see how reality really is, but it can be almost this glittering hard-edged jewel, and we also need to feel how we're not separate, and feeling into that can happen really well through the four immeasurables, which I like to call the four boundless qualities. And these aren't just passing sentiments. These are capacities that we are born with to some extent, but we can develop through practice. And this has been proven in the laboratory again and again with actual, hard brain science, measuring people's capacity. Interestingly, even newcomers to those practices can experience effects during the practice almost right away. And it can be actually measured by these devices. Then what happens within weeks is it starts to be experienced even in between meditation sessions, just within weeks to newcomers. But of course, as you can imagine, over time, people who have mastered these practices, the 10,000 hours plus of practice that we've all heard about, they literally had off the charts reading, like readings that had never been seen before by the neuroscientists. They actually thought there was something wrong with the equipment.
Yeah, it's a conversation that often comes up about Matthew Ricard being the happiest monk and being off the charts. And of course, the skeptic in me, as the hard scientist, is where was our baseline? Do we know what his brain was like before he ever started? So I add in that bit of cautionary tale with it that indications are good, and certainly from my own life, contemplative practice has these kinds of salutary effects.
Yes, and the scientists had the same thought. And so they wanted to measure people over time so that you could take the same person before and after, right? And they had, some studies looking at people over different amounts of time and so on. And of course, now they just need more time to complete those studies, but long-term longitudinal studies are being done.
I think Cliff Sarin in California has currently the longest running longitudinal study of contemplative practice. I'll have to get in touch with Cliff again. I haven't had him on for a while and just see how that's going. But yeah, absolutely. How is it over time? What do we see?
Yeah, well, he did the Shamatha project, which was 3 years. But, now what we're talking about right now isn't shamatha, but the four immeasurables. Now, they had to practice loving kindness or metta, which is one of the four immeasurables or boundless qualities. So
let's talk about that a little bit. For those who may not be familiar with it, because this podcast is not primarily a Buddhist audience, let's talk about what these are. And I really like the way you describe them as these are capacities that people have. And that's also one of the things that I want to mention to the listeners is that we are talking right now using a lot of terminology that we're familiar with from Buddhism. And that's not to say that these are the exclusive owned purview of any particular religious ideal. They're not. These are human capabilities. And I just want to make that clear.
Let me name them, and then everybody will recognize them as being something that we all are born with. And we'd probably all like to expand our capacities for. So loving kindness is the term normally used, but I think that sounds pretty jargony. The problem is love is a term in English that means, at least a dozen different things. And English is very poor at delineating those different things. What we're talking about here is deep affection, which I remember one student a long time ago when I was leading this sort of practice, and I wanted people to start with somebody they already feel that for. She said, she was sort of bah humbug. She said, I don't really like anybody. And I said, I just had a hunch. I said, do you have a cat? And she said, yes. Just so happened she had a cat. I said, well, do you love your cat? And she said, oh, yes. I said, okay, start with your cat.
There you go. I always mention pets whenever I lead metta meditation. Is it maybe a pet or even a place that moves your heart?
Well, I like to pick a sentient being, a fellow sentient being. The hard one that people have, and I really like to start with this one, is ourselves. And Westerners are pretty terrible at feeling love for themselves. And then another of these four qualities is compassion. And that's another thing we're kind of lousy at doing for ourselves. But how do we love thy neighbor as thyself if we don't love ourselves? Where is the basis for it? So let's get a really good basis for it, because we're a sentient being also. We are made of that same perfect source, however you want to call it, as anyone and everyone else. And so we need to start with ourselves. And even if it's a little uncomfortable, just I suggest pushing the envelope, as you do with any capacity that you're trying to build. It's stretches in yoga or biceps in the gym or any such thing. This is really just doing the same thing, making the pathways, turning them into, big streets and eventually highways, the same thing. So I've mentioned love or loving kindness, compassion, and then a third one is sympathetic joy. Now that's kind of the flip side of compassion, because when you're speaking of compassion, you're feeling empathy with someone else's suffering, compassion you're feeling with. And you naturally want to take that suffering away because of your caring for them, and you want to replace it with happiness. And so that's the basic exercise that you do to expand that. So in sympathetic joy, you're looking at somebody who's experiencing something good and they're happy, and you're sharing in that happiness. You're happy for them. So if somebody you care about has just met somebody they just really love and they're talking about it, you can't help but smile, right? And you may even like give them a hug. Oh, I'm so happy for you. That kind of, that's what we're talking about. So we have that capacity, but that can be greatly expanded, and it feels wonderful, by the way. All of these, I've had people do their own personal experiment and write down how they feel before I then teach these to them and then lead them through it. Then I have them write how they feel afterwards. And invariably, people, even if they started out, they were already feeling good, they feel so much more deeply satisfied and happy in kind of a deep way, like deep joy. And then the fourth of these capacities is equanimity. And what's meant here is that you feel equally loving, equally compassionate, and equally sympathetically joyful for everyone. So you start with yourself and you go out to those people who you love, myself, my people, and then people we don't know very well, then people we don't know at all, and we might normally feel totally indifferent to. And we just keep stepping it out until it's everyone. Eventually, even once we build the capacity, even people who have been kind of troublemakers for us or we find annoying or this kind of thing, even extend these qualities to them. Now that's equanimity, feeling equally strongly these other three qualities for everyone.
Yeah, and that is a practice that, because again, this is a practice. These are things that you can work on and exercise and develop. Is that this is not giving a gift to someone you hate. This is helping yourself as well. This is changing your heart when you can even have that sense of care, a sense of kindness toward someone that you might not be feeling the most charitable towards. They may be in the greatest need of that care.
Yes, and I've looked at some studies they've done on different kinds of stress. And it turns out if you want to shorten your lifespan, the best stress for you to have is resentment. So in case you don't want to shorten your life and you do have resentment, you might consider not nursing that grudge, but rather finding a way to offload that grudge. And luckily, in these practices, you don't have to ignore, or how can I say, you don't have to agree with what they did.
Right.
It's not about that. Forgiveness isn't about agreeing with something or practicing selective amnesia. You don't
You're
have,
not giving a hall pass to bad behavior.
no, not at all. But you're acknowledging this is a fellow human being who maybe they did screw up. Maybe we just have a real difference of opinion. That also can be, really frustrating. Like, our kids don't always agree with how every single thing we've done to raise them. I don't agree with everything my parents did. But now a lot of that, two people could disagree on some of these things. It's really a question. Was it right or not to have this particular curfew or, whatever? Uh, or, husbands and wives or husbands and husbands and wives can really run into some serious disagreements about how to use their finances or whatever it is. And there may not be even a right or wrong, but there can also be straight up right and wrong here.
Yeah. Yeah.
In all of that, you don't have to condone. This is about getting underneath the whole story to your common humanity. That everybody's trying their best and nobody's perfect, including, should I mention this, ourselves. And so, given that, and given that we don't want to load our own heart down with a grudge, and we don't want to make these boundless qualities have a boundary. It's like, loving kindness for everybody except so and so,
Right.
We're making our hearts shrink. And that's not what we want to do ever. We're trying to expand them, and we feel so much better when we do. So I always like to, when I teach these 4 boundless qualities, I always like to address forgiveness.
Now, you are currently writing, I think, finishing up a book on these 4 capacities, these 4 boundless capacities that each person has. Can you say just a little bit about that?
Yes, in the book, I do introduce each of them and teach it in the book, and give practice cards in the back so you can sort of have a handy little cheat sheet when you're sitting there in the morning, rubbing your eyes and starting your daily practice. And I also do talk about forgiveness. And there are resources that I point to for if you decide, okay, it's really somehow it feels like it's going to be satisfying to indulge this righteous wrath. And, over time, it kind of never is as satisfying as we think it's going to be. And so if somebody's ready to consider dropping that grudge, and now they're ready to look at how can I actually do that, Dr. Fred Luskin of Stanford University did a study years ago with, for example, mothers of kids who were killed in the Troubles, as they call it, in Ireland. And if he succeeded in finding ways for them to be able to practice forgiveness with something as extreme as that, I wanted to see what his method was. And he does a step-by-step method, that did prove to be effective. So there's one example right there, and I do cite him in the book.
Well, I hope you'll return and talk to us more when the book comes out. It's going to be a while before that's available. For folks who are listening to this episode, I will have links to other materials from Lama Tsomo on the episode page. Is there anything else you want to mention to the listeners before I let you go?
Yeah, with the book that I have already written, Why is the Dalai Lama Always Smiling? In there, I introduce a couple of practices, one of which is the compassion practice that is one of these 4 boundless qualities. So we have that. Another thing you might share is our e-courses, and I also teach that compassion practice there. And we, myself and Tuku Sangak Rinpoche's brother, Ken Rinpoche, these are Tibetan lamas. So the brother teaches these 4 boundless qualities in our upcoming batch of online courses. So if people go to namchok.org, which you'll have spelled out for them, they can take advantage of that.
Great. So that will be linked on the episode page. Our guest today, Lama Tsomo. Nice to see you again. Thank you for being here.
So happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.